very much looking forward to hearing from our next two speakers from the Kailash Satyarthi Children's Foundation, Mr. Owain James, who's the Global Campaigns Director for the Satyarthi Children's Foundation. Nice to see you, Owain. He's co-organized several of the largest global campaigns on children's rights and development in the last 20 years, including co-founding Make Poverty History, coordinating the Global Campaign for Education, and the One Goal campaign that was around the 2010 World Cup. He also founded the I Decide campaign on sexual and reproductive health and rights, and recently has been supporting representative youth organizations to work together through the 100 Million campaign. And then we have Winnie Nyandiga, is that right, Winnie? Winnie Nyandiga, the Africa coordinator for the 100 Million campaign. Winnie is a regional organizer of the 100 Million campaign, a global youth and student-led organization demanding the rights of all children and young people. In this role, she develops and implements strategies while identifying accelerated policy routes and key areas of intervention for freedom, safety, and education for every child. She has 7 years of experience in top management policy and advocacy, student and youth activism, human rights, social campaigns, politics, leadership, and management. What have you not done? Winnie is the question. She specializes in mainstreaming cross-cutting children, students, and youth issues by reviewing, auditing, and analyzing legislation and policy in Kenya and globally. As a proponent of democratic representation and good governance, she has held leadership roles at national and international levels. Her strategic understanding of the political landscape and how to influence it has enabled her to manage teams in over 10 African countries and 40 across the Commonwealth. Very, very excited to have you both here, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say, particularly about this, the report that you shared and the campaigns, and then look forward to the discussions after.
Thank you so much, Sujata, for the nice introduction. I'm going to begin, and then I'm going to invite Owain to come on board. So I'll begin. Where do I begin? About the report. In January 2022, I was part of a meeting with advocates and campaigners across Africa called by the Nobel laureates Lima Bowie from Liberia and Kailash Satyarthi from India that agreed on a statement on justice for Africa's children. The injustice faced by African countries are continuing to grow, denying Africa its fair share of global resources, deepening inequality, increasing vulnerability to climate change, and leaving millions of young African children out of basic school and working in child labor and other human rights abuses that we see children undergoing in Africa. So, for instance, African concerns have been consistently overlooked, whether it was during the global pandemic, and this came out strongly in the summit that was in Paris earlier, a few months ago. And I remember the president of South Africa really amplified this on how our issues were overlooked during the global pandemic. Then we have the climate crisis, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and it is likely to continue with the war in Israel and Palestine right now. So, and this continues to show the reality that the SDGs are failing because of the deepening international discrimination. And so we are demanding, we continue to demand for collective global action. So this statement got support incredibly quickly from over 95 laureates and leaders backing it, and it inspired a major report that we wanted to share with you today. This report was launched earlier in the year, and hopefully we will discuss it today. The other thing is, I align with Christian's sentiments on how the Global South and the Global North can continue, can unite and continue working together, especially in times like this of multi-crisis, that, as Deborah earlier put it, that they are mutually inclusive. So we need to work together. So I will now invite one of the co-authors of the report, my colleague Owain James, to provide a brief summary of the main findings of the report, including some of the national injustices faced by children in Africa. Thank you, Owain. Over to you.
Thank you, Winnie. It's a pleasure to join you today, and quite appropriate to follow the last session, because this report was shared with the C20 meeting in Nagpur back in March, and I think it's very relevant to the discussions both on the G20 and the ones I caught the tail end of around the challenges of movements and the challenges of why we're not having the impact. But what I'm going to do, because there's a few different graphs, and for about 15 or 20 minutes or so, I'm sharing the report, and then Winnie will share more on the mobilization. She's very much leading this initiative. My bit's on the report side. I'm going to share the screen just so that it's easier for you all to see it. But before I launch into it, I just want to check it's all okay. Can everyone see it okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'll get started.
Thank you.
So in 2021, the ILO announced that there was a shock global increase in child labor within just the first 4 years of the SDGs. More children were being excluded and exploited, not less. And somehow the analysis showed that this increase in Africa was higher than the increase in the world total. And this simple graph, which starts the report, shows what happens. You can see, actually, though the global total went up, that was due to a huge increase in sub-Saharan Africa. The first line shows the global child labor in the rest of the world, a drop of some 35 million. And the second line shows the huge increase in sub-Saharan Africa. So big since 2016 that it's now outweighing the fall elsewhere. In fact, since the SDGs started, over 10,000 African children have become child laborers every single day. The majority of them young children under the age of 11. So this round table that Winnie mentioned of African youth leaders with Lema Gabowi and Kailash Satyarthi that looked at it, asked us to investigate it. And the first thing we thought we'd do is, how has that happened with child labor, not other sectors and not other MDGs? But when we looked closely, it was clear it was happening elsewhere too. For example, if we look at education, you can see the change in the number of children out of school since 2015 at every level, primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, the same pattern of a major reduction in out of school children in the rest of the world and a shocking rise in children out of school in sub-Saharan Africa. So far from being a one-off, the data is similar on child stunting from malnutrition. And as the next graph reveals, it's the same for extreme poverty. This is the most common measure that's been used by the UN to track the number of people who live on less than $2.15 a day. And you can see since 2005, some years up, some years down. And then since the SDGs started, there's been this huge increase of over 20 million people, over half of whom are children. But you might say, well, how does that compare with other parts of the world? Well, actually, if you look at the share of where people in the world live who live on less than $2.15 a day, you can see the scale of the change is even clearer. In 2015, more lived outside of sub-Saharan Africa. But by 2019, just 4 years later, over 60% of the world's poorest people lived in sub-Saharan Africa. It's been a titanic and a historic shift in inequality between the world's regions that will certainly get worse when the new data gets released by the World Bank. So why has this happened? Well, what we did is we started by looking at GDP per person, probably the most common measure of comparing wealth between countries. And you can see a significant percentage growth in richer regions, a dip for the pandemic in 2020, but it soon bounces back. For sub-Saharan Africa, though, it's a very different story. Though the world grew $11 trillion richer between 2015 and 2021, GDP per person in sub-Saharan Africa actually fell. And if we compare the changes by US dollars, not by the percentage change, you can see something else. It would only take a tiny share of rich country wealth for sub-Saharan Africa to be able to grow at the same rate as other countries in the world. Richer countries would barely notice the impact. But this hasn't been happening. And in fact, since 1980, wealth per person has increased by tens of thousands of dollars in richer countries. 20,000 in high-income countries, 29,000, I think it is, in North America, 15,000 in the European area. In Africa, it has increased by only $96. It has been going up more every 10 weeks in richer countries than it has in 41 years in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, historic injustices that have never been rectified left the world incredibly unequal already in 1980. But something else in our world has clearly been increasing this inequality still further for African children. So we then took the report and we looked at what could it be? Why is Africa getting such a low share of global growth? Does it have the resources? Well, yes, huge natural resources, some of the highest in the world. Are those resources valuable? Are they being used? Yes. Many of them are rare and precious. and in demand. Those resources are being used in the global economy right now. For example, if we look at the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, it's in the top 10 countries with the most natural resources in the world. It produces over 70% of the world's cobalt used in batteries in mobile phones, laptops, and now cars. It has literally powered the tech boom that added trillions to global growth over the last decade. But the profits are moved offshore. The billionaires are created in other countries, and such little tax is paid to the government in the DRC. They don't have the resources to provide basic services to all their children. Many children in the DRC are left so poor, they end up working in these very same cobalt mines to survive. And I'll show this in more detail by having a look at education. And we compare two countries, Luxembourg and the DRC. And you can see that the education expenditure is much higher in Luxembourg. Now, you might expect that. It's a developed country in a richer part of the world. But this is not expenditure per child. This is the total expenditure of the education ministry. And why is that a problem? Well, we look at, first of all, at the size of the countries. You can see that the DRC is over 400 times larger than Luxembourg. And what about the number of children? Well, if we compare the number of children, there's more than 600, 650 times more children in the DRC than there are in Luxembourg. Yet, expenditure for the education ministry is higher in Luxembourg. If we want to compare it per child, we actually have to squash the bar for the DRC right down. And you could see, in fact, it's hard to see just how small the percentage is when comparing education expenditure per child. And a way that to put this a bit more clearly is if we compare it to the Statue of Liberty, from the toes to the tip of a tail, if we make the Statue of Liberty the expenditure per child for Luxembourg, how high off the floor would the DRC bar be? It would be 4 centimeters off the floor, over 1,000 times less. And what problems are we building up in our world? What chance do we have of a more equal future if there's that titanic difference in what's being spent on education? And this is not just an issue for those two countries. We just picked them at random. You can see how over time it's actually getting far worse. The increasing school expenditure per child, which is a good thing in high-income countries, is also, but it's not being followed by the education expenditure in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's got so extreme now that more is spent on 5 days of education for an American child than the lifetime of a child in Burundi. And you might say, well, what can be done if all African governments don't prioritize education? This is a chart that shows the percentage of government budget spent on education, how much the governments in Africa and Europe prioritize education in the expenditure available to them. And you can see that actually we have to go to number 20 on the list, to Sweden, before we come across a European country. If we put them all out in display, you can see that actually the percentage spent in Africa, on average, is far higher than the commitment made to education in the European Union. There were a few countries, Angola, Nigeria, South Sudan on the end, but overall, the proportion is being spent. So that's not the challenge. That's not what's causing this. We need to look at how the government revenue is so low. Why is tax revenue so low? And the first injustice we looked at was the tax injustice. So in the mining sector alone, the IMF highlights that governments in sub-Saharan Africa are losing 450 to 730 million per year. Tax avoidance more generally is by transnational companies is costing developing countries 200 billion every year. What does that mean? Well, the report created a new indicator looking at the total tax revenue for a country divided by the number of children in that country. So if the government spent all its money on children, it's not going to, but if it did, how much would it have available? And you can see the difference. This chart really explains why so many children in Africa have no school to go to and no doctor to see. You will be aware of the big tax change that came through when the Biden administration proposed a fairer tax deal, a welcome step to try and equalize tax. Right at the beginning, it said it was aiming to ensure a fairer distribution of profits and taxing rights amongst countries with respect to the multinational enterprises. It could have challenged this historic injustice sub-Saharan Africa has faced on tax. But unfortunately, page 1 of the statement, they decided to exclude all extractive industries, the industry that could have helped the most. So how does that happen? Well, you look at the countries who signed it, it will give you a little bit of a clue. Less than half of African countries have signed it 2 years on. Over 80% of high-income countries signed it, and the deal moves ahead anyway. The decision, The negotiations were led by the OECD. They lead all world tax affairs. It has 38 member countries, but none are African. There's not much justice here. And if we look at some of the other injustices in the report, I won't go into as much detail as the tax one, but we did look at a whole range of topics, and I'm going to run through a few. First of all, on COVID-19, the G7 announced this global agenda for action during the pandemic, $12 trillion to support the world. And you can look at the share that went to the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 0.2%. On top of that, as this map shows, vaccine apartheid took place. Whilst African requests to manufacture their own vaccines were supported by some G20 countries like the US and India, it was blocked by the UK and Germany. And in fact, richer countries stockpiled vaccines, whilst many African countries didn't even have enough supplies for their frontline doctors and nurses. Humanity faced a common enemy like never before with COVID-19, and our response was to leave the poorest and most vulnerable to fend for themselves. Where was the justice? Now, acting like a central bank for the world in August 2021, the IMF created a major new issue of special drawing rights to ease the global liquidity crisis. I'm sure many of you are aware. The IMF said it was going to particularly help our most vulnerable countries who were struggling to cope on the first paragraph of their release. The historic 650 billion should have been much needed good news for the children in Africa denied COVID-19 funding and vaccines. However, the special drawing rights were allocated extremely unfairly. This graph shows how much funding governments in each region receive per child. And for sub-Saharan Africa, it was just a discriminatory $50. So how did the UK and Belgium get more funds than all 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa together? Was it the population? No, they have a fraction of that. It's because they have more votes than all 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa combined at the IMF, as they have done since it was founded in colonial times. When the most important financial organization in the world is accountable to richer countries, and in fact has always been led by European, is it any wonder that the global economic system is unjust? If we look at aid, you can see a similar and shocking trend. Hardly any countries have achieved the 0.7% target since the 1970s. But in the rest of the world, gradually, this chart shows in blue, you can see the fair share of the amount the rest of the world should have received in aid, the poor countries in the rest of the world, if governments had kept their commitment on 0.7%. And in red, you can see the amount that sub-Saharan Africa should have received. And whereas in 1990, it was about the same, the proportion of aid that was being received, which is in orange, and the proportion that should have been being received was around the same. You can see over the last 30 years, as poverty's increased, as the proportion that should be allocated to sub-Saharan Africa has increased, the amount hasn't. And in fact, there's now this huge inequality on aid, not just in terms of volume, which I think people will be familiar with, but in terms of this chart was created by looking at where in the world their infant mortality rates are high and trying to allocate resources to based on that. And you can see just how biased ODA is against Africa from the chart. Climate injustice was looked at in the report. We have a global climate crisis, but that name hides the fact that the world's climate was ruined by a very particular set of countries. The repercussions are global, but it was caused by a very set of countries. The blue bars show the rate of each country has contributed to the climate crisis per person, the amount of CO2 emissions per person in the last 100 years. It's a very unequal graph in blue, but the orange bars show how vulnerable countries are to the climate crisis, according to the Notre Dame Index. And as you can see, the heaviest vulnerability is being paid by those with the least responsibility. The sub-Saharan African countries are all over on the left. In fact, if I go back to look on these, sub-Saharan Africa is 95% of the world's rain-fed agriculture. With the high current temperatures and significant deserts in many countries, Africa is particularly vulnerable to the rich countries' inability to curb their emissions. And that's partly why rich countries made that promise in Copenhagen in 2009 to make up for causing this climate crisis and to help countries cope. 100 billion in annual climate financing would be provided, and they'd be familiar with that target. To put that number in context, it's just half a week's worth of the 2020 COVID-19 funding given in richer countries. It was a pretty low bar for damaging the planet. But how did countries get on against that? Well, donors admitted in COP last year that only 80 billion was provided. They didn't even hit the target. And it's somehow worse than that because most of that figure is actually loans and included projects with a very small climate component. If you follow the OECD's own accounting rules, the entire climate financing provided was 31 billion, less than a third of the modest commitment they made 10 long years ago. And some of that new funding actually came from cutting existing aid budgets. Diverting funds from health and education for marginalized children in Africa was not what was promised in Copenhagen. And again, you have to ask, where's the justice? And then the fifth and the last of the big ones that we looked at was on debt. Whilst people and companies can declare bankruptcy, the situation for countries, as you know, is very different. And for decades, debt was used by richer countries to force conditionalities on poor countries, including, tragically, with structural adjustment programs. Now, more recently, that debt is to a broader range of countries, government of China, major multinational private companies. And even though the private lenders such as Glencore and BlackRock, the largest known holder of external private debt in poor countries, they get high rates of interest when things go wrong, such as a crop failure or recession. Those companies actually don't pay for that share of the risk. When African countries are bankrupt, they're forced by the IMF to keep paying the debt back to private creditors based in richer countries, who are the priority. And gradually, the debt is transferred from those creditors to the IMF. We are in the middle of a new debt crisis in countries including Uganda, Angola, and Zambia. As you can see, debt interest payments have overtaken education and health budgets and have got a lot higher since 2015. More and more countries have been trapped in unsustainable debt since the start of the SDGs, but there's been hardly any international interest in the crisis and even less action. The much heralded G20 debt initiative from a few years back has supported only a couple of countries in 3 years, and the rest of the countries have been left bankrupt, and it's children that pay the price. And we did an analysis in the report of where those children live. And if you use the IMF's own data on countries that are in effect bankrupt, you find that there's 55 million children affected. 99.95% of them are African children. And you have to ask, is this why the world and the G20 has been so slow to act on the new debt crisis? We also in the report looked at some national injustices. It wasn't just focused on the international side, and I'll take you through a couple of those quickly. On governance, we did mention that a number of countries are spending high proportions of the budget on education, but that's not true for everyone. And if we look at education, health, and social protection, you can see that in certain countries in Africa, there's a double whammy effect from the international injustices that really restrict the resources, the amount of Africa's resources that stay in Africa and are able to support children in Africa, is made exacerbated by governments not making enough of a commitment to child-related budgets. And we've costed up that injustice and include that in the report. We also looked at the rights of adolescent girls in particular, and a lot of countries have policies that could greatly improve the situation. This one looks at child marriage. You can see in the first column the percentage of women in countries that are married as a girl aged 14 or younger, so 12, 13, or 14, some countries as high as a quarter. And then we compared it with the percentage of men who get married under 18, who are married as a boy, so when they're under 18. And you can work out from that, actually, there's quite a large percentage of girls who are 12, 13, and 14 who are getting married to adult men. And in action on child marriage and other sexual reproductive health and rights, access to family planning, for example, is an area that we feel that national governments could be doing a lot more on, even within their restrictions. And then we touch on corruption. Now, it's a real barrier to investment. It damages the economy, diminishes trust in the government and society, discourages political participation, it restricts access to public services. But it's commonly cited in richer countries as the main reason for poverty in Africa, and that's far from the truth. For the report, we did a new analysis where we compared the country's corruption ranking with Transparency International with the economy of the country, with the GNI per capita. And you can see that 9 of the top 10 countries who are doing better than their economic situation would imply are in sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a number of countries that are doing a lot on corruption. It's not the main reason why countries like Benin are why countries like Switzerland are 100 times richer than countries in Benin. And then we also looked at conflict, and there's a number of conflicts that are tragically harming children in Africa and have to be stopped. But it's also cited as a core reason for poverty rather than other injustices. And we looked at the number of fatalities using the Uppsala index that records conflict fatalities around the world. And you could see that proportionally in the last decade, the number of conflict fatalities in Africa was roughly in proportion to the rest of the world. And you can also see in terms of military expenditure, all 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa together spend less on the military than Italy and are a tiny fraction of the global military expenditure. So there's a lot, and the report makes a strong call for action in certain conflict areas, which are tremendously damaging. But we did also look at and try and understand, is that the key driver for why there is poverty? And it's clearly military expenditure and conflict is not the core reason for it. Anyway, we estimated costs across these injustices, and overall we costed 9. And there were other injustices we could have looked at: patents, trade rules, land reform, raising capital that was mentioned in the previous discussion, the impact of major agribusiness. But we at least wanted to look at the ones we'd identified, what the costs were, and the estimated cost, if we look across it, come to just over 4 trillion since in the period 2016 to 2021. And in blue, you can see the international injustices, and they account, we think, for around 95% of it. Now, both of these figures are very approximate. There's lots of detail in the report, hundreds of references and so on. But there will be overlap as well between some of these injustices. We want to improve it. We want to work with others to further improve the analysis, and looking for academic partners for an updated version of the report. But it's clear that these modern injustices, underpinned by the inequality and representation of Africa in international fora outside of the UN, are worth several $1 trillion in the first 6 years of the SDGs alone. Indeed, when you look at this graph, it's not so hard to see why child labor in Africa has been going up since 2015. But the heaviest cost is not measured in dollars, but in children's lives. And the final graph we did shows the number of children under 5 who've died in the first 5 years of the SDGs. And the difference is huge. The only way to put it in context is to compare it with other numbers. And when we did the analysis, we saw that more young African children had died in the first 5 years of the SDGs than all the world's military victims during the 5 years of World War I. And in fact, the annual amount of African child deaths at the moment is about the same as all the total US casualties by war since 1775. All the US combat deaths, non-combat deaths, wounded, missing in action in the last 250 years. The most upsetting thing of all is we know how to end poverty. Country after country has achieved it. Given the chance, people will lift themselves and their families out of poverty if we end the injustices. The report does have a section to look at some of the recommendations, and the first of those is calling for an end to the injustices, like the ones that have been mentioned on debt and tax, other ones on trade we haven't got into today, special. But there's also a need for fair representation for African countries. No African country is a member of the G7. Only one African country out of 54 is in the G20. It was welcome that the African Union was invited by India to join this year, a welcome step. But it's still hugely, a lot of these problems started around the time the G20 developed in 2008, and the UN has gradually been shifted. The OECD, as I said, has 38 member countries, not a single one is African. Voting power at the World Bank and the IMF is dominated by non-African countries. The systemic injustice behind it also needs to change, as well as changing some of the actual specific injustices. And finally, we feel there needs to be a major resource transfer. You can see in any large union, any shift to a country functioning, whether that's the United States or the European Union, there's a transfer of resources for those political unions to exist between the places where the wealth accumulates and some of the other places perhaps where some of the wealth is made. We need to see a shift whilst we are changing those injustices to address the huge and titanic inequality that there is. And two of the calls that are made, one is around a global child benefit system being introduced that could act a bit like Bolsa Familia has done in Brazil, but act across all low-income countries. It would cost, we think, around $50 billion to provide benefits to every child and new mother that live in a low-income country. And that's affordable within common ODA levels. And then we talk about, for example, resource transfers are linked to the climate injustice and education. looking at developmental financing, focusing on education, instead of just having a 0.7% of GNI target. If you remove the share that goes to multilaterals, which should also still happen, you are roughly left with about 0.5% of GNI should be going in country aid. And if you look at any of the data on where the world's poorest people live or where children are marginalized, about 60% of that should be going to Africa. So we're looking at 0.3% of GNI as a specific target for African ODA. The responsibility, mainly lies with the richest countries over the last few decades. But as the G20 is taking on that important global governance, we feel it must put its own house in order. And with leadership from the current and upcoming hosts, the G20 could instead support the world's most marginalized communities. But it also requires, for the solution, us to get involved. And we need to look at awareness of the actual underlying situation. So much of the money, of the public perception on development is about charity rather than political causes to poverty. Unlike, say, work on human rights with Amnesty or work on the environment with Greenpeace, where they explain it as a political problem, most development charities say, give us $5 and we can end poverty. And it's clear that around the world, public opinion generally blames Africans for their own exploitation. And that's because of a failure, really, within civil society to explain what is happening and why. And then we also need to see action, which is and solidarity with the groups that are being led from Africa. It blows me away that you've seen such progress. You were touching in the earlier debate about the failure really on some of the wider economic justice campaigners over the last decade. But we've seen great progress made on liberation campaigns where those campaigns are led from within the community affected. And yet, when it comes to poverty, by far the majority of the campaigns that are active are not led by people affected and living in extreme poverty. And so, we feel there needs to be a shift there, and the wider student youth movement should be getting behind the campaigns that are emerging in Africa. But ultimately, if alongside giving food or helping hungry children, which is still important, we all stood together to ask why so many children are hungry, imagine the impact that could have. World wealth has doubled in the last 20 years. The report asks the question, how rich do we have to be before we act? We feel it's time. And I'm going to pass now on to Winnie, who will chat through some of the work she's been leading on the mobilization and the wider campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. In line with the solutions, young people will not been left behind. So looking at the Justice for Africa report and just trying to see what our role is in all this, especially in advocating for our own rights and protecting our own future. The 100 million campaign supported by the foundation, we work with students' movements, we work with individual youth activists at the community level, but we also work with youth-led and youth-serving organizations apart from individual youth activists. And what we have seen post the report started earlier in February when young people came together, led by the All African Students Union and other youth groups in Africa, supported by our peers across the world in a few countries, especially in high-income countries. And we came up with what we call the Justice for Africa campaign. So what the Justice for Africa campaign does is that I want to speak as we because I come from the global south and I come from Kenya. And most of the times when we campaigners are involved in fighting for rights, we target the government, talking of national injustices, from corruption, from the conflict that we experience in our own countries. But with the Justice for Every Child campaign, we are not letting our leaders off the hook. What we are saying is that there is just so much African leaders can do. And as Owen has showed in his report, is that if most of the African countries right now used all the monies that remains after we pay our debts and interest, it won't even be enough to fund our education. And so we are bringing in youth activists from Africa for them to tackle both aspects, both the international injustices and both the national injustices. Because from the analysis of the cost of injustice in the world, which is $4 trillion, 3.8 trillion is international. Only 0.2 is in country. And so this campaign comes on board to challenge both, again, as I said, the national and the international aspects. So as youth activists, as campaigners are campaigning in their different countries, we continue to encourage them to incorporate more global dimensions. And this has been seen through the advocacy and policy activities that we've been doing, including reaching out to international financial institutions, governance systems like the UN, AU, European Union and the African Union. The other thing we've been doing as campaigners in Africa is just direct outreach to our peers across the world, young people from high-income countries to stand with us in solidarity, because the solidarity unfortunately has been very minimal, and yet we know how critical that solidarity from privileged young people in high-income countries would go a long way in supporting the work that we are doing. Owain, could you just help me with the slides of what happened on October 20th? So this is how October 20th looked like. We had mobilizations in over 20 countries. And here they are. These are all African countries led by young people themselves, youth activists, and in some areas like Liberia, which is going to be a spotlight country, we saw survivor advocates of these injustices leading these marches. And these actions differed across the region, from rallies to marches to town hall meetings to stakeholders engagement. Young people just putting their demands on the table and making it clear on what we want our decision makers to do. Next slide, Owain. And so this is Nigeria. What happened in Nigeria is we had mobilizations across 3 states of Jigawa, Kano, and Jos to demand what the young people in Nigeria were demanding for the rights of Almajiri children and generally out-of-school children. So there is the other problem I know we face in Africa is we have very good policies, but when it comes to implementation, it becomes a problem. And this is what the youth in Nigeria were picking up, that there is a law that is pushing for a commission for Almajiri children that has not been implemented, and they were pushing for that. What is unique about Nigeria is they were able to also mobilize in Jos. For those who don't know, Jos is a very unstable area with in-region conflict, and for them to just come out on that day and mobilize and demonstrate and protest for their rights was very big. And next slide. The next slide is Tanzania. Tanzania also came out in 2 regions, the main city, Dar es Salaam, and their island area. Here they also came out to demand the rights to education, increasing investment in education, and an end to child labor. And what happened in Tanzania, they were joined in support by local government leaders and district education officers. What is unique again about Tanzania, just sharing and echoing our earlier speaker, Deborah, I feel like Tanzania has been able to implement what most big organizations across the world would do. Because in Tanzania, we have what they call the Tanzanian Coalition Against Child Labor. And this is a coalition of over 49 countries, of over 49 organizations, including small organizations at the community level and bigger organizations like Plan International, Save the Children, and they are working together in solidarity. And this is something that we don't see in the world. Every organization wants to focus on one thing. People want to work in silos. But in Tanzania, youth-led organizations, youth-serving organizations, teachers, students, children have come together to work together in solidarity. Next slide, Owen. Our next slide is Cameroon. Our activists in Cameroon work in the eastern region, specifically working with refugee children, survivors of child labor, and hugely survivors of human trafficking, child trafficking. And on the 20th, they came on board to demand the rights in these areas. And they did media advocacy. They went to primary schools, also just bringing children on board to sensitize and create awareness about their rights, what the government is supposed to do, and the role of international governance system as well, in as far as their rights are concerned. Our second last spotlight country is DRC. We all know how DRC faces very many challenges, including right now. But youth activists, students, and children in the mining town of Uvira came out. They developed a set of demands calling for justice for their peers who are still trapped in the war zone, in the forest as child soldiers who do not have access to education. And together they marched to the office of the local government led by the mayor to deliver their petition. And then our last country that we are highlighting is Liberia. And we know Liberia, just like so many other sub-Saharan African countries, has seen an increase in children out of school. And so they came out, again, youth activists, students, survivors, advocates, and they marched in the streets of Monrovia to demand their own rights. Owen, the next slide. The next slide, no, sorry, just go back to Liberia. Yes, this first slide. The two children in front are survivors of child labor, and they were leading this march. They have shared their testimony before that has been shared in at the UN, at the AU, and they also came out in Monrovia to continue demanding for their rights and to amplify the voices of other children and other students who could not join them this day. And then our last slide is Ghana. The reason why I've put this slide to me as a young people, it shows continuity. So these two are young men from Ghana, both leading the National Students Union of Ghana. The first one was in office in February. So in our mobilization in February, he led the march. The second one is the current president. Change of guard, but the goal is the same. Justice for Africa, education, access to education, and equality and equity. So for me, this photo shows continuity. It shows the consistency of we young people, student leaders, that, you know, we are in it. We want to see our rights and our demands delivered. So that's it. You can find more on 100millioncampaign.org. And yeah, it would be good to have support, especially from young people from high income countries, because that's what we are struggling with right now. But we are trying to reach out to them because this solidarity is very important. As I said earlier, the world is facing multi-crises right now, but they are mutually inclusive. And so we have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for that presentation. So let me say, ask for people to think about questions. And if you have questions, just feel free to unmute or to raise your hand. But maybe I'll start with one question. Well, a lot of what you were saying in particular, Owain, reminds me of Thomas's work, thinking about institutional responsibility and the blame being on corruption or on national politics or procedures, when in fact we need a significant institutional reform. So you mentioned now, particularly with India taking the lead in the G20 and Brazil coming up, what opportunities do you see for maybe some realignment of these political priorities, particularly as particularly as we're sort of changing economic landscapes with the BRICS rising? So what are specific opportunities you think are that you see coming up, or you think maybe down the pipeline?
I'll happily share a couple, but Winnie, please jump in as well. Winnie's again smarter than me on the politics. On the Brazil G20, we think there is an opportunity. Kailash, the Nobel laureate Kailash Satyarthi, who's part of the foundation of this, the foundation we've been working for, met with Lula a couple of months ago to discuss opportunities. And we understand that a big priority for President Lula is to make progress on inequality next year, and he's looking at some initiatives that might do that. He's already brought back Bolsa Familia in a really big way in March. He's committed to and knows that redistribution and that promotion of social protection is an essential part. But also, I think Dilma's his successor in Brazil, and now his predecessor as well, but his chief of staff who became president in Brazil, she is now head of the BRICS Bank. And I think a lot of the stuff around the BRICS meeting showed, a change in balance of power. Now, we see a lot of that through the lens of what that means for Ukraine or the conflict, and that's understandable. There are, wider situations happening. But in terms of economic sense, I think a large part of it was trying to establish, they're still keen to establish an alternative to the dollar. They're still fed up of waiting for IMF and World Bank reform. And, there is a potential now with the BRICS expansion to try and bring in some significant finance ministries. We might yet see. Now, this is not me speaking as a foundation, just personally, I see that, and I think that part of that might be a step towards greater financial clout for the BRICS in terms of the BRICS Bank and what they might try and do to offer countries alternative points on currency. But I think in terms of justice for Africa, we've got to be balanced on it. Some of that debt is held by China. The DRC in particular, a lot of where the cobalt went is actually into Chinese companies, and then through that into the into California and other parts of the global tech boom. But not all actors. We've seen the damage the Wagner Group have done in Russia in many places. So I wouldn't, portray it as, BRICS are going to come and solve all these things. But I do think there's, frustration with some of the global injustices, and I don't think people fully understood in G7 countries, at least, the depth of the anger around the way some of the support packages and the way the rules on patents and the sharing or not sharing of the COVID vaccine technology helped. I think that was a sea change, and I think we'll see some ramifications. But there is opportunities in Brazil, and you've got a government that's very committed to action on poverty. So I think the Brazilian G20 and then the South Africa one after that has potential too, depending on how politics develop there. So there is an opportunity, whether it be taken or not, I'm not sure.
Great. And Winnie, I don't know if you want to add anything to that. I have a question for you as well.
No, I feel like Owain has covered it all. Of course, I'm very keen. I'm not an economist, but I'm very keen on the debt issue in Africa. And we see opportunities in people going back to the drawing board and just see how they can negotiate the terms. If we have countries using over 50% of their tax revenue to pay debt and interest, then, that's problematic.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask you about, your work around awareness campaigns, and maybe now not south to south, but north to south, maybe sort of effective strategies or initiatives. Because what I think, one, there seems to be no real global protocol around supply chain, right? Global supply chains. And what I've noticed, at least in the United States, is people want to know how products are made, but it's almost impossible to find any information on it. And I was just thinking about this, particularly for Halloween, because I imagine there would be a number of people who would be looking for alternative candies, for example, to be able to give out, but with no sort of awareness of how that chocolate is being produced and where they could get chocolate that doesn't have that isn't produced by slavery, for example. And is part of the problem creating awareness campaign in the global north around these issues, and would that help create maybe to lead a boycott for some of those industries? Because where there is awareness, there does seem to be people seem to be moving in a direction where they want to support companies that have transparency in the supply chain, for example. And now there's maybe a class element here too, but that might help at least motivate or incentivize an industry to shift. So I wondered if you thought it would be helpful, one, to have a global protocol for supply chains, which don't doesn't seem, there were discussions about it, but I don't know if, and I know we have a colleague in Connecticut. Why I'm asking is because she had been working on a global protocol, but I'm not sure that moved along very much. And also this awareness campaign, would that be helpful, in the global north?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, you want to go first?
Owain, please jump. You can jump on board.
Winnie, you'll talk very much on the campaign side. I won't. I'll leave that to you, Winnie. But on the policy side, on supply chain, the European Union has brought forward this new set of regulations that's going to try and extend the protection offered to children in Europe globally, and the same on the environment side. That due diligence side, it's long overdue. It's been ridiculous for decades that if a German company used a child labor in their mine in Germany, they could be taken to court. But if they used a child in Africa, they couldn't be. And that's being looked at being changed. I think it's coming up to the European Council for ratification later in the year. There is, a worrying rollback on some of the child labor protections in the US at the moment, and we've seen, issues domestically. I think overall, supply chain is important, but it is part of the issue. And I think sometimes consumers think, oh, what can I change? What can I change? What to change my purchasing? But actually, what we need to see is those northern campaigners and youth organizations align behind what the African youth organizations are saying. And, what the bigger issues really are is if you've got such titanic wealth difference, you can close down factories that are using child labor, but if you don't also deal with social protection and have some benefits or some safety net or some progress on economic issues, you will not, children will shift into a different form of child labor. The core reason why in the last 6 years we've seen 10,000 more child laborers a day, and we've seen one new billionaire every week. The world's wealth has gone up $11 trillion, but child labor is shooting up, is because of the economic inequality in distribution. And it is a good step for companies to change their supply chain. It's a good step for consumers to avoid problematic companies or look for good supply chain. They help, but it's not, we don't want to present a panacea of an easy to do option around that. We think the deeper understanding and action on the structural inequalities is what is needed. But when you lead that, so maybe you should talk more about what the Africa campaigners are working on and what we're hoping people get behind.
No, I totally agree with you. And also, the aspect of awareness creation, which is very important. And until we did this report, right, and I told you as a campaigner from Kenya, every time I'm on the streets, it's against the government. Like the corruption is very high, and all that. But now this report unearthed the international side of things, as we found that out of 4 trillion, only 0.2 trillion is in country, 3.8 trillion is international. And so the more we continue creating this awareness, even within the African campaigners themselves, before we go to global north, is very important. So definitely awareness creation is at the heart of it, of this change, because it is through awareness creation that we will know ethical shops to get alternative candies and chocolates.
Great. And go ahead, Thomas.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you 2 things. One is with regard to the channels that you mentioned where we might be able to exert some influence on the next G20 presidency in Brazil, and also the Asian Development Bank headed by Dilma. So if you have any inroads there, people we can contact, people we can maybe work with. I have a little bit, but at a pretty low level. And I think we should work on this right now, because the handover is this month, and a year goes by very quickly. I was pretty heavily involved in the G20 this year, and it works like molasses. It's very, very inert and very slow going, and so before you know it, the year is over and not all that much has been accomplished. And we have only 1 year after that, the South African year, with any chance. But the Brazilian year is probably our very best chance to really move things along. The second thing I wanted to say, caught my attention, the remark that Owain made very early, and that was the remark about since the MDGs. And I noticed the same thing. I noticed that in 2015, things began going very dramatically the wrong way. So I noticed it first in the FAO annual report, the food security report, where the number of food insecure people just skyrocketed, and especially in Africa, just as you had highlighted, but 59% up in Africa since the SDGs were announced. And I think it's 46% for the world at large. So very, very dramatic increase. And that led me to think that somehow the propaganda machines of the world have managed increasingly to take paper progress for real progress. So that, I mean, I happened to be at the Paris Climate Summit, and I saw people crying tears of joy, falling into each other's arms over this incredible success that we would now limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And of course, the success was all on paper. It was people said, this is what we want to do, and we all agree that we want to do that. But everybody makes their own contribution and decides how much they will contribute. It was very predictable that this mere agreement wasn't going to be very valuable as such. And ditto with the SDGs, that people somehow think that by having declared that there will be no poverty by 2030, they have somehow solved the global poverty problem. And so if you ask people on the street, they will tell you that we have made incredible progress with poverty. Things have gotten so much better, and it's dramatically going, Bill Gates and people like that are supporting these views. So I'm wondering whether you think that the SDGs may even have been counterproductive, and if so, is there a way in which we can make them productive again, or reduce at least the degree of their counterproductivity?
Winnie, would you like to go first, or would you prefer me to?
Please go first.
So on the Sherpa one, I think it's the BRICS Bank that Dilma leads, not the Asia Development, but the BRICS Bank.
That's a different bank. Okay.
Yeah. It's they're trying to establish the BRICS Bank.
Where do they sit, the BRICS Bank?
Well, I think Dilma's still working out of Brazil, but I'm not sure quite.
I thought
there's a lot of
they were in
Chinese
Shanghai.
money.
Yeah. Okay. So then,
the Chinese is the big bank for it. But I think the expansion of other countries like Saudi and UAE is to bring money in. But I think for those the Sherpas, best place to start. If you engaged around this year, you know it as well as us. The meeting that I mentioned happened back in July. I think Brazil is very active in what they're thinking about, and it's a lot of these international forums go up and down depending on the domestic policies of the host, and we happen to have, a government that's really committed to action on inequality, and a president who's, as he's coming back for a second term, wants to change things quite strongly. So I think you're right about that and about the need to approach soon. And I understand inequality as the lens, so I think that would be the starting point. But we either work directly with Lula's office or with the Sherpas. That would be our starting point. You may have better context with another G20 partner, so it's a good thing to swap knowledge on and let us know. On the sort of broader challenge, I think it's spot on. It's I think the malnutrition stuff we were looking at the other day for the inequality stuff, and I think the rise in Africa started in about 2008, 2009, around the same time the G20 leaders meetings started to form. And in Africa, it's almost doubled since 2008. The number of people who are hungry has gone up by over 100 million. And I think it has now started to go up in other parts of the world. But if you isolate the African numbers, it started way back then. But I think it has got worse since 2015. That's when we see it impact on child labor, and where we see the biggest impact on the $2.15 a day data. But it's on education and on malnutrition. It started in 2008. Ultimately, the SDGs, they're a bit of an encyclopedia of development. So much more gone into them. There's probably not much accountability around any one specific target, and governments can pick and choose the ones that they want to focus on when they talk about it. I think there has been some positivity. I think the Gates agenda to try and have a more positive spin, positive emphasis to show that aid can work is important in terms of people who believe that it can never make a difference. I think you have to say it does make a difference, but I do think it's over. I don't think it's based in the reality of what's actually happened and the systemic injustices behind that will need to be fixed if we're to live in a more equal world. You know, I talked about the 1,000-to-1 difference in the education budgets. I think in the report we note that the literacy rate in the DRC today is about the same as it was in the US after the end of the Civil War back in the 1860s. You know, the chasm is so big, and yet we're still taking, and we, speaking from more developed countries, we're still taking most of the money and most of the best resources, most of the best land, you know, away. And if Africa's children cannot benefit from the resources in their continent, then, you know, we are going to see these problems perpetuate. So we're hoping is that, you know, those work on education and on health, on water, on other sectors, you know, maybe there can be a wider coming together around, maybe around inequality next year, and certainly. Policy-wise, our big advice, I've got too much grey hair now to be a youth campaigner, but as a former youth campaigner, the big advice is what can we do to get behind the African youth campaigners that are focusing on the bigger issues, because, you know, almost all the money spent explaining development to the wider public is spent by people who don't live in extreme poverty, and almost all of it is spent fundraising for their own organization, rather than, and which can make a difference, but is not going to you know, solve the wider issues. Anyway, so Winnie, please add on that.
Probably the one thing I would add would be a positive for me in my personal analysis in the recent past has been maybe backing up the UN, and specifically the UNSG. If you look at his recent remarks in terms of justice, injustice, equity, and equality, he's been saying the right things. And I feel like when we have leaders who are leading from the front, they need backup. So yeah, that would be my other suggestion, to back up leaders who are leading the way. There are very few. So how do we identify them and give them the backing and the pushing that they need?
Fantastic. So we're almost at the hour. Wendy, let me just ask you on that, because I know one of the strategies for the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, is to create this pipeline to key industries, whether those, you know, judicial appointments in the courts, and really now, you know, focus on building a set of leaders that can create, because you're going to need to create that structural change with those sort of pivotal figures that can be in certain industries or organizations that can do that. Is that part of the campaign as well? Thinking about a pipeline to sort of keep, you know, whether it's we're thinking about banking, finance, law. Is there a, you know, as part of the program to sort of build leaders and really finance those leaders to be able to take these key positions?
Yes, it is, because I know as an organization we are also very political, right? Because we just want, rather we hope governments would do what they're supposed to do, right? As opposed to other side shows. So just holding governments accountable. In line with that, yes, we do. Especially our young people who maybe are running for office, who are in different strategic positions right now in the different governments across the continent. Yes, we do work with them, and in positions where we have identified transformative leaders that we can push them to this position, yeah, we also back them up. But also beyond that is also actively engaging with leadership at the national, at the local, and at the community level, just bringing them on board, working together as a collective.
Wonderful. Well, I think we'll end on that. Thank you both so much for a very powerful presentation. I'm so glad to meet you on Zoom, and that you were able to join us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sujata. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.